Hello, everybody. Mentor Lawyer with Ira Shuffle. With exciting news, we have done an interview of a juror in the second trial in the case of State of Florida versus Katherine Magbanua, which of course regards the murder of FSU law professor Dan Markel back in July of 2014. There's nothing more valuable than the inside knowledge of the people involved in the process, and nothing more important than what the jurors were thinking in relation to the case, the trial, the evidence that came in, and what happened in deliberations. So I'm going to read the questions, and Ira is going to read the answers from the juror. We're not going to identify who the juror is or tell you anything about the juror. Let's get it started. Did you know anything about the case before the trial? If so, can you tell us in general what you knew?
I had a passing familiarity with the case. I remember when the murder happened. I remember it being a big deal in Tallahassee. I remembered something about a Prius, and I remember the two men were eventually arrested for the murder. I didn't realize that the case was still going on. I have young children and have gotten out of the habit of listening to NPR in recent years, and we don't get the local paper or have a TV, so I'm a little bit sheltered from the news at the moment.
What was your impression of the jury selection process?
The process was fascinating to me, especially looking back on it. I had never given much thought to jury selection before, but now I realize it's such an important thing for the lawyers to get right. I thought it was interesting that the lawyers wanted to know if we watched crime or law TV shows or if we liked documentaries.
What was your impression of the case during jury selection?
Things were much more lighthearted during jury selection, so I don't think I realized what an intense case it would be.
What was your impression of the lawyers during jury selection?
I thought they were both very friendly. It seemed to me that Mr. DeCoste was trying hard to be likable.
Do you think both sides were correct in picking you? I.e., did you think of yourself as someone who could be fair if selected to be on the jury?
I do. I was talking about this experience with my therapist this week, LOL, and she pointed out that I have a lot of qualities that probably make me a good juror. Thoughtful, good listener, open-minded.
In retrospect, knowing how deliberations went, do you think that the jury selection process was effective in picking a fair jury?
I do.
Do you recall anything from the opening statements? Anything that impressed you? What themes did you identify from each side?
The opening statements were a first taste of the different styles of the lawyers. I appreciated the methodical explanation by the prosecution, and I could sense the passion from the defense. I don't recall being impressed by anything in particular at that point. I was just trying to take it all in and follow along.
Did you form an opinion about Dan Markel from the opening statements, i.e., whether or not he was acting reasonably in the divorce proceedings? Not that it really matters. Do you think it was important to understand everything that happened between Dan, Wendy, and Wendy's family during the marriage, divorce, and afterwards?
From the opening statements, the description of Dan Markel matched what I already knew, or thought I knew about him from the information in the media around the time of the murder, that he was a loving dad and a respected law professor who was going through a messy divorce. I think it was helpful to get a general overview of the case background, especially because there was at least one juror with absolutely no prior knowledge of the case, but I don't think it played into Ms. Magbanua's trial directly.
What were your thoughts about the state calling Wendy Adelson as a witness? Was the use immunity issue confusing to you and or the rest of the jury?
Her testimony was probably the most exciting of the whole trial, but I'm not sure I understand even now how it either helped or hurt Mrs. Magbanua's case. The use immunity part was and is confusing, and I won't pretend to understand. I don't think we talked about that aspect as a jury, so I don't know if others were confused or not.
What did you think of Wendy as a witness? Credible?
My impression was that her testimony was very well rehearsed, and she had been coached on how to look and act like an innocent person. I was skeptical of her credibility, mainly because it seemed like her testimony was staged, rehearsed.
What was your impression of DeCoste's cross of Wendy?
I remember getting the feeling that, wow, Both sides hate this witness. And that was surprising to me in the moment, although I understand it better now. I thought the Coast's statement, quote, "This is all about you," end quote, was powerful. I don't remember spending much time as a jury discussing Wendy's testimony. I don't think it was very important to our decision. It was definitely interesting, but not a key piece of evidence in this trial, in my opinion.
What was your impression of Professor Lacasse as a witness?
I found him to be mostly credible, although I can see how he could have some motivation to throw Wendy under the bus. But I believe that he was honestly disturbed by some of the Adelson family's jokes and comments about hiring a hitman, and understandably upset with Wendy for telling the police that he could be behind the murder. I took his testimony with a grain of salt.
What was your impression of Luis Rivera as a witness? Credible? Did you, in the end, accept all or part of his testimony? If so, describe the most important parts of his testimony you accepted and/or that the jury in total accepted.
Some of us found him more credible than others. He obviously has motivation to help the state, but I personally believe the state when they said they were not telling him what to say. To me, he seemed to be telling the truth to the best of his memory. The defense's issue with the, quote, lion versus owl discussion seemed like a red herring to me.
Was the cell phone data testimony of Corbett useful during deliberations? What was the key cell phone evidence discussed in deliberations? How did it help the jury reach its final verdict?
Corbett's testimony in the cell phone data was very helpful and was one of the main things we examined and discussed. As a jury, we talked about the large amount of coincidences we would have to believe if we were to believe that Ms. Magbanua was innocent. For me personally, one of the most impactful pieces of evidence was the trips to the car rental area during the time the cars were being rented by Garcia and Rivera, especially with a call to Geico at the same time. We consider the defense's point that Ms. Magbanua could have been visiting a friend in the area, but the fact that the cell records and her talking to Charlie Adelson for a lot of the time she was in the area didn't line up with a visit to a friend. Other pieces I thought were important: Ms. Magbanua's phone being turned off the night of the murder, and then turned back on as she was driving south from the area where Charlie lives, and the calls to Luis Rivera only during the trips to Tallahassee.
What was your impression of Detectives Sanford and Isom? Credible? Fair?
Mostly I found them credible and fair. I appreciated Sanford's calm and confident demeanor. Isom seemed a bit more defensive, but I got the impression that this was because he was aggravated at the defense's insinuations, and not necessarily because he was lying about anything.
What was your impression of the cross of the state witnesses by the Coast and Kawas? Was the defense scoring any points in your mind? Or was the defense wasting everyone's time? Or somewhere in the middle?
I never felt like my time was being wasted, and all of the testimonies were fascinating to me. And then parentheses, this is my first experience with the criminal justice system, and I learned a lot. I understand that the defense was trying to find any inconsistencies in the testimony and point them out. If I were on trial for a crime I didn't commit, I certainly would want such a diligent defense team.
What was your impression of the state's evidence on the issue of Magbanua making a lot of money, cash, around the time of the murder?
I thought this was an important piece of evidence.
What did you feel was the main defense theme before the closing arguments?
That Ms. Magbanua was the connection between the Adelsons and the hitman, but she was unaware of anything that transpired, and it was all planned behind her back.
What did you get out of the Dolce Vita recording? How important a factor did they become in jury deliberations? Was that piece of evidence alone enough to push everyone over the edge of doubt?
It was important, but not enough on its own, especially since we couldn't hear anything Ms. Magbanua said on the recording. What was important to us was the way that she didn't seem upset by the things that Charlie Adelson was saying.
What about the wiretap calls? Any of those make a strong impression on Magbanua's guilt? Which were the most important?
I don't think anyone in particular stood out, but in general, she did not sound like an innocent person on the calls. She sounded like someone very clearly talking in code, and the whole thing with not wanting to repeat the bump call phone number over the phone was bizarre and very incriminating in my opinion.
What was your impression of the defense witnesses other than Magbanua? Was the defense effective in calling investigators in their own case?
I would have liked to have heard from Sigfredo Garcia. It seems like his testimony would have been helpful to their case. He would be one person that could have confirmed Ms. Magbanua's innocence, along with Charlie Adelson. I thought their witness, Mr. Fitzpatrick, the former friend partner of Charlie Adelson, was helpful to their case by showing how Charlie is overbearing and eventually you just go along with what he's saying. That made an impression on me, but in the end, it wasn't enough for me to find reasonable doubt.
What was your impression of the defense strategy to question the ethics of the investigators and prosecutors? How did you feel about that?
That was uncomfortable. I see why they felt the need to question the integrity of those witnesses, because those testimonies did hurt their case. Overall, I found the investigators to be credible and honest, and the cross-examination didn't change that for me.
Did you think Katie was going to testify? Were you surprised to learn that she was going to testify? In the end, did the fact that she testified affect the outcome one way or another? In other words, would you have voted the same had she not testified?
I was very surprised, and I think we were all surprised, because the defense spent a lot of time in jury selection going over reasons a person would choose not to testify in their own defense. Overall, I think the consensus was that it was not helpful to the defense for her to testify. She really didn't have any explanations to offer, and that was frustrating.
What was your impression of Katie during Kawas's direct examination?
She seemed to have more to say in response to the questions during direct examination.
How effective was Sarah Dugan's cross? Too harsh? Just right?
It was a bit harsh, but I think her tactic made a significant impact. I think Ms. Dugan was genuinely frustrated by the lack of answers she was getting.
What is the most memorable about Katie on the witness stand? General impression of her performance after she finished.
Most memorable would be the amount of time she said she didn't know or couldn't recall the answer to a question. I didn't get the feeling she was being completely honest or forthcoming.
Give me your impression/grades for Kappelman's initial closing argument.
I appreciated the thoughtful summary of the whole case. Her comments brought everything together. I don't think I know how to grade this type of thing, so I won't try.
Kawas's closing argument for the defense.
I think she did a great job without having a lot to work with. Clearly a very passionate and talented lawyer.
Kappelman's rebuttal argument.
Amazing job with the rebuttal. I was very impressed with her ability to formulate a powerful rebuttal in such a short time.
Give me something good for each side, your impression of the trial.
Gosh, I was super impressed with all the lawyers and Ms. Kappelman in particular.
Any mistakes for each side?
I don't think it was helpful for Ms. Magbanua to testify.
Okay. I want to know what stuck with you. Any argument that convinced you? Did the arguments help you put it all together, etc.?
I was truly very impressed with everyone involved. Personally, I preferred the style and demeanor of the prosecution. The defense came across as very showy and theatrical, which is not, shall we say, my personal taste. But no question, they were all so smart and talented. The prosecutor's comments definitely helped me put everything together and tie it up. The defense threw out more red herrings, focusing on things that didn't really seem to matter, but I know they were working with what they had and working hard to poke holes in whatever testimony they could.
Your impression of Judge Wheeler. Did you feel that he was fair or favored one side or the other?
I was impressed with him and really liked his demeanor. He was an anchor for me in tense moments, and I thought he did a great job of handling the courtroom. I didn't get the sense that he favored one side or the other.
Were you able to hold off having an opinion until jury deliberations?
Yes, I went into deliberations feeling undecided, although leaning towards a guilty verdict.
Do you think jury instructions are too complex? Any suggestions on improving how that works?
I didn't think they were too complex. I appreciated having them as a guide as we went through our process, and we referred to them often.
What became your understanding of proof beyond a reasonable doubt?
We spent a significant portion of time talking about what, quote, beyond reasonable doubt, end quote, meant. And I do think it's a hard concept to describe. I don't think it ended up being a big issue for us during deliberations, though. Without speaking for the other jurors, I can say that my interpretation was that most of us did not have doubt as to her guilt. It was more that some of us felt uncomfortable with the specific charges in light of the other perpetrators who have gotten lesser sentences or who are still walking free. But we had to put those thoughts aside.
How was the foreman/foreperson picked?
There were two people in particular that displayed a lot of leadership qualities, and one of them was willing to be the foreperson, so we went with that.
Did the deliberation start with an initial vote? What was the result of the vote?
We took an initial vote roughly an hour into deliberations, and the result was mixed. There were a fair number of undecided votes on all of the counts.
Did you or anyone wonder who paid Magbanua's defense attorneys? If you did, was this something you discussed in deliberations?
I don't remember this coming up in our discussions. I wonder about it now after reading more about the case after the trial was wrapped up.
So describe the process of how the jury reached the verdict.
We took several votes over the course of the day, each time with fewer and fewer undecided votes. Towards the end, there were just a couple of undecideds, and we addressed those particular concerns as a group. This was my first time on a jury, and I had assumed we would be sort of trying to convince each other of our own viewpoints, but that wasn't how this worked. Everyone was very kind and respectful, and we took turns giving our opinions and addressing specific concerns. The foreperson did a great job making sure everyone had a chance to speak.
What happened during those 8 hours of deliberation?
We started by discussing each witness and their testimony, and then we moved on to looking at a lot of the evidence again, especially the wiretap calls, which we listened to in the jury room, the cell phone data, bank records, and the Dolce Vita video, which we needed the headphones to hear properly, so we did that in the courtroom.
Why the request to see the Dolce Vita video again?
A few of the jury members wanted to listen to it again. I found it helpful to hear it again, as I picked up on more the second time through.
Would you have liked to have a transcript of the Dolce Vita recording?
I think that would have been helpful, although I understand the defense's point that the evidence should speak for itself.
Did anyone change their minds during the jury deliberations?
There were a fair number of undecided votes, especially early in the deliberations, but in my opinion, it was more about feeling uncomfortable with the severity of the charges in light of the fact that of those truly behind the murder, the wealthy people that paid for it, had been mostly free for so long, while the others, not the wealthy people or people of color, had been incarcerated for years. This is something that bothered me in particular, and perhaps a few others. In the end, I had to separate my feelings about that and vote based on the evidence and the jury instructions.
Did anyone vote not guilty at any point? If so, what changed that person's mind?
I honestly don't recall. I think there were probably a few not guilty votes, at least on some of the counts early on. I wish I could remember this more clearly, but it's kind of a blur.
Do you think all jurors cared about getting it right? Were the jurors who cared less or not as much, or who were not very involved or were just going along?
I think we all cared about getting it right. No one was rushing through the process, and everyone was very respectful, even though some of us made up our minds much earlier in the process than others.
What was the experience like for you?
It was a really incredible experience. I was very nervous about being selected, but it ended up being such a fascinating and eye-opening 2 weeks. Honestly, it made me consider going to law school.
Do you feel that you made the right decision in the end?
I do. I've struggled with it quite a bit, mainly because it's a very uncomfortable feeling, having someone else's fate in your hands. I don't like that at all, but I don't think that I made the wrong decision.
How about Kawas's argument that the fact that Magbanua did not agree to cooperate and go free means she's not guilty? What did you think about Kappelman's response to that particular point/challenge from Kawas during the closing arguments?
That argument was one of the most powerful pieces of evidence, if you want to call it that. It is one of the only things that made me truly question whether she really was innocent, because it doesn't make any sense at all. But also, Kappelman's response was spot on. There are lots of possible explanations for why Ms. Magbanua would have chosen not to cooperate if she was guilty. She could be being threatened. She could be paid in some way. She could have lied once and decided to stick with the lie, or even have convinced herself over time that she was telling the truth. All of that is speculation, of course. When Mrs. Kappelman addressed that comment, I thought that was one of the most powerful and interesting moments of the whole trial.
So let me ask you this, Ira. Your initial impression of this interview, do you think this is useful, and were you surprised in general? What is your initial impression?
Yeah, I think one thing off the bat is just, we heard a lot of comments from the attorneys, and you were there in the courtroom, so you could speak to it as well. I think you did speak to it. But the attorneys mentioned several times how conscientious, and I think Judge Wheeler mentioned it, like how conscientious these jurors were. And I think that really comes across from these comments, just the answer to your questions. Just, I'm impressed that it seemed like they went into the deliberations with an open mind, which I think would be hard. And then they really just kind of were cooperative and worked together. And, I was impressed. I mean, it seems like that's kind of how this whole thing is supposed to work. And that impressed me a lot.
And that was my reaction as well. It's like, well, I felt when reading the answers to the questions that I posed to this person, I was like, wow, this makes it feel like, there may be critics of the jury system, but, this works. At least, there may be mistakes, but in this particular case, it worked the way it's supposed to work. And that was my impression from it.
There was a couple of things that you pulled out from the trial that is interesting, and they brought them up in their responses. One was DeCoe's trying hard to be likable. You did a video on that, and then also the Kappelman's response in her rebuttal in the closing arguments, how quick she was to go after Kawasa's challenge, and that also stood out to the person. Also, I think that was interesting. That you saw those as an observer and broke them out as separate videos.
Well, thank you for noticing that. I appreciate it. So a vote of confidence for mentor lawyer as well, not only for the jury system, but also for mentor lawyer. Awesome.
Did the jury discuss who they think ordered the hit? Charlie, Wendy, Donna, Harvey, or some combo of them? What was the jury's opinion? What was yours? I don't remember discussing this. We really tried to stay away from speculation and focus on the judge's instructions, to base our decision only on the evidence presented to us. Personally, I feel certain that Charlie was involved, obviously, but I have no idea if Wendy/Donna knew about it prior to the murder. Did the jury discuss the logic of having Katie as a shield or wall to keep the killers from knowing who ordered the hit? I don't remember discussing this in those terms, but we did talk about there seemed to be no connections between the hitmen and the Adelsons, other than Katie, and from the evidence presented, they didn't seem to even know the names or contact information for any of the Adelsons. Did the jury discuss the smarts of having a middlewoman who had a relationship with the shooter, so that if the shooter gets caught, he won't testify against the mother of his children? No, although this is a really good point, that hadn't occurred to me. What did you think when Kawasa opening and DeCoste during Wendy's cross pointed to Charlie's lawyer and Wendy's lawyer? That was so interesting, and was when I realized how the outcome of this case would have a bigger impact than just on Katie. I wondered why they would make an effort to be in the courtroom instead of watching online.
Well, listen, guys, thank you for watching this video. I think this was really awesome that we got to do this.